Okay, we are now live. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. This is a meeting of the Citizens Advisory Committee for Capital Expenditures. Today is Wednesday, November 16th, 2022. Thank you all for joining for this evening's agenda. We didn't have any prepared presentations. We sort of want to recap where we've been. We've gotten the overview of the capital needs inventory. We've also had some detailed presentations from our Parks Department and their various capital needs, much of our street department, and as well as last week we had discussion about city bridges. We do have, again, joining us, Rich Bradley from the Board of Public Service, as well as Chris Amos from our Equipment Services Division. And they would like to go over some of the updates to the inventory that we've discussed so far with different updated numbers and such that has been updated along the way, which this revised inventory is basically got the newest and latest and greatest estimates on some of those project costs. And it is also posted on the website for your reference. So we'd like to do that and go through some of those and any more details about any of those projects. And then open it up to questions about any of those projects as well. And if you need some more details on some of the items we've already that we didn't have formal presentations on. And then also talk about any other projects, just soliciting some ideas for projects that you may have that have not been discussed. And then wrap up with a discussion of the survey that we're going to be issuing hopefully tomorrow to get your input on both what your take is in terms of priorities, in terms of the projects that have been presented as critical, and then give you the opportunity on that survey to submit any other projects that you might want to submit for consideration to the Capital Committee. And so that's what we're looking at going forward. And with that, Rich, I could pull up on screen the inventory if that's what you need, and then we could go through some of those and proceed from there. If that'd be
great. That'd be great.
All right. Well, let me pull that up. Let's see. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'll just take your lead, Rich, wherever you want to go.
Sounds good. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Citizens Advisory Committee for Capital. As Paul said, my name is Rich Bradley. I'm the president of the Board of Public Service. And what I would like to do now is just take a few minutes to walk through the capital improvements needs summary and highlight some changes that were made in it and make some clarifications on items to be, so you're very clear on where we are with them and what the needs are. There have been some really good questions over the past few weeks. And so we spent the time with staff and worked through some of these estimates to get a little better numbers on some things. So first of all, if you would turn, I'm going to talk about updated things on the inventory. So Paul, if you would turn to category A, sheet number 1. So at the top of the list, the commentary came up a couple weeks ago when Streets did their presentation about the Cass Avenue Streetscape Phase 1 and Phase 2. And so just to refresh your memories, this is a project, these are projects that are being done in relation to the new NGA facility on the near north side. So the Phase 1 project is a $19 million estimated project with a match share of $3.8 million, assuming that we would get a grant for it. So what has transpired there is LCRA and SLDC have provided $1 million to my office to begin the design work. And the design work is approximately $3.9 million on this project to get it started. And then the idea is to also utilize funding from a $5 million congressional earmark from Blunt, along with an upcoming application for a raise grant. And those two things together would all help us to achieve this $19 million project. So at this point in time, we as the capital committee do not need to find the $3.8 million that was highlighted as critical. So I would ask you to just take that off the list for your consideration for projects needed. The project number 2 for Cass Avenue, phase 2, if you will, was slid over to a needed category. And the reason for that is because the agreement between the city and NGA is to fund phase 1. And so that's what we're doing with all the conglomeration of funding I just talked about. So phase 2 at this time is not a critical project. At one point in time, it was considered to be part of the NGA agreement. It is not now. So we will move it over to a yellow category and ask you not to consider that as one of our critical projects. Item number 3 on the list is another question that came up, and this is the Hall Street Drainage and Roadway Improvement Project from Adelaide to Riverview, and it's denoted as MSD and MoDOT funding. This project started off as a MSD Project Clear project to be funded. The idea was to add formal water drainage alongside of that roadway. If you're familiar with that stretch of Hall Street, there is no drainage channels or canals. The water pond's very bad on the street. And so MSD's goal was to capture that water and get it into the sewer network. Along with that, MoDOT also pledged funding to come in and do a lane diet to match the city's project, which was from East Grand to Adelaide, and repave that street. In the process of doing all this, there was a delta in cost for the design. And the most recent information that we have from MoDOT and MSD is that they are working together to reduce the design cost and the construction cost of this work. And so that $5 million that we were originally asked for from those two agencies to make this a complete project is still in consideration. It's still being worked through, and it may wind up not being existent at all for the city, or much less than $5 million. So at this point, we have moved it over to a needed project and ask you not to consider that as one of our critical projects. All right. Paul, if you would go to page number 3 of 3 on category A. Thank you. Item number 24, arterial street paving. After the street department made their presentation a couple of weeks ago, we had a $14 million number in for arterial street paving. We're updating that number to 14.9, which reflects the presentation from the street department for what's needed there. Also, there was a shown local match share for that project. And local match shares are only critical when there is a grant that could be applied for that type of work. So for arterial street paving, this is a maintenance item. And so this is not something that we could apply for a grant for unless it was a much more extensive project. And so we removed the local match share funding from that. And so the ask is critical for $14.9 million. The same on item 25, underground downtown lighting vault, a $2 million ask. And I also removed the local match share funding for that, as that is also not a project that would be grant funded. So the ask is for $2 million for that critical project. Paul, if you would go to category B, and I'm going to be looking at structurally deficient on-system bridges, number 4. Thank you. So this is the Lindell Union over Forest Park Parkway. And the previous to now, the number was shown at $9 million. In fact, for the Lindell Union over MetroLink, it was also shown at $9 million, with each of those having a local match share of about $1.8 million. Those were the original requests that were written in the grant agreement when we applied for it a year and a half ago. And so we've updated these numbers to reflect the current estimate that the consultants have provided us, and they just recently came in. So each of those projects are now estimated at $12.5 million with a local match share of $2.5 million. So the ask on 4 and 5 critical need is $2.5 million for each of those, or a total of $5 million for that bridge complex. Number 9, Loughborough over the Union Pacific Railroad. We talked last week during the bridge conversation that this is a project that we would like to apply for a infrastructure grant for from the Build Back Better program from the federal government. In order to do that, we need to have a shovel-ready project ready to build. So what we're asking for is to fund the design of this project, which is about $1 million. And I have removed the local match share shown there because we would fund the design for the project totally, have the project ready to go so that in 23, when MoDOT replaces late 23, early 24, replaces their bridge at Loughborough, we would be able to come in and do the construction, which is item number 10. And that still shows an $8 million project with a $1.6 million local match share. And so the ask there is $1 million for design and $1.6 million for the actual construction for the match against the grant. And then as we look down the list, without going through each and every one of these, other major repairs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. I have removed the local match shares to avoid confusion. These are repairs. They are not eligible for grants, and so therefore there is no local match share. The color red and shows the actual amount that is needed for each of those, which reflects the actual total value of the project. So, for example, 1 is 100,000, 2 is 75,000, 3 is 250,000. There are no local match shares on those. The numbers shown are the numbers requested in critical. All right, Paul, if you would go to category C, number 4, which is Soulard Market renovations. You heard a couple of weeks ago from the Parks Department, the Parks Director and the Park Commissioner about a number of parks projects. One of those projects that was talked about were critical renovations to the Soulard Market, electrical, mechanical, structural, roofing, exterior, tuck pointing, restroom renovations, a number of items there, sand renovations were provided. The estimate that we had previously was $7 million for those renovations. When Parks presented, they gave a number of $7,503,000. And so we've updated that number to reflect and match their presentation. And that is a critical need. Okay. If you would turn to in 1 second here. Okay, item G, category G, and look at all the way at the bottom of the page. There's an item for electrical vehicles infrastructure item that was shown as needed for $2 million. That is actually shown as part of the vehicle needs on Exhibit H. And that is shown at $2.4 million for the electrical vehicle charging and $350,000 for the battery electrical vehicle incremental cost. And so Chris Amos will talk about those at the end of my discussion. I believe that updates all the numbers that had changed on the inventory itself. I did want to highlight a couple of other projects while we were talking about this. They were covered the last time that we did this, and some of you were involved in this and some of you were not, but I think it's very imperative to just take a minute and cover a couple of these. Paul, if you would go back to Exhibit E, item number 1. Exhibit E, item number 1. Keep going back, buildings.
Oh, D?
E.
Oh,
number
I see.
1, buildings. Thank you. So at the top of the list, number 1, it says Old St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department headquarters. The critical item here is replace HVAC equipment that serves the 7th floor radio tower equipment. That particular item is a critical item simply because that radio tower that is on top of the police headquarters is what communicates, does all the communications for all of our police officers and police facilities around the city. And so if you will keep in mind that during the summertime, the temperatures rise, it's on the top of the building, all the radio equipment is in there generating heat. We need to replace critically the HVAC system that is in that room that keeps that equipment cool and operating throughout the summer. And so it's a $200,000 ask. When we do the PSAP, which we will probably talk about here in a little bit, that radio tower should move to Jefferson and Cass. But since we are approximately 3+ years away from that, we need to replace this HVAC equipment in order to support the police radio system. Okay, if you would page to F, which is corrections and other public safety. The top of the list. Thank you. So there are 2 items at the top of the list for the CJC. If you are not aware, we are currently doing about a $20 million project at the CJC due to issues with doors and locks and systems that have failed over there. A system that was not included in that work, actually 2 systems that were not included in that work originally, are the upgrade to the fire alarm system for $500,000 and the roof replacement on the building, which is $1.1 million. And so those are obviously both critical items, but I do want to take a minute and talk about the fire alarm system as in a couple other facilities we have. The fire alarm systems obviously are a life safety item. And so if these systems are not working in total and performing all their proper communications in a building that houses people 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 364 days a year, we need to make sure that we fund a system like that to protect those individuals that are housed within that building, and as well as the staff that is there. And then if you look down just a little bit farther on the list, it talks under public safety. The same item F is the public safety answering point. So I just take a minute to talk about the public safety answering point because this is going to be a relatively hot topic. And so something that everyone on this call should know about and understand completely. And I don't think we've really covered a lot of detail on it. But basically, the public safety answering point would be a new state-of-the-art emergency operations center combining the following agencies of police, fire, emergency medical service dispatch, city emergency management, and citizen service bureau, all from the city of St. Louis and within one building. The building would also include an emergency operations center for things such as tornado, floods, major fires, or other public safety events where a number of the city agencies would need to gather and communicate in order to support our first responders. So the new public safety answering point would be built on the west end of the existing City of St. Louis Fire Department headquarters facility at Jefferson and Cass. The proposed facility would be a one-story building, approximately 17,000 square feet. And it would be add-onable, if that's a word. You could certainly add on to it at a later point in time, depending on, what the population of the city of St. Louis is. Currently, 17,000 square foot would be enough to cover our population. So the new facility would call taking and dispatching services for all the agencies I talked about, a 365-day, 24/7 operation, and it would be built to all the current standards for earthquake and all the hazards that could possibly affect that building. Many of the surrounding municipalities and cities, counties have these. St. Charles has one, St. Louis County has one, Jefferson County has one. And so the idea here is to have a very secure place where we would be able to do those first responder functions. And so currently there's about $5.8 million that has been already allocated for this project. We are currently in phase one for the feasibility study, which is working with all the agencies, developing all their recommendations for the facility and infrastructure and critical design items. And this is a very detailed process requiring interviews and surveys and protocols and all the things you can imagine that each of these agencies do. So with that said, we're looking for additional funding for this facility. The estimated total project cost to design and build this facility is $42 million. As I mentioned, we have about $5.8 million in funding already allocated. And there is also, and I will just mention this, a conversation or an infrastructure bill right now through ARPA that is being floated that has a possible $15 million worth of funding in it to go towards this. And if that would be approved, we would still need approximately $20 million, a little over $20 million in order to $21 million to finish this facility. So the consideration there is that it is a major facility in the city of St. Louis. It would be something that would make our 911 system new and up to date. I think everybody understands there are issues with the 911 system and the way calls are transferred and the waiting time. And this project would resolve all of those issues for the long term. If you look down to the next item underneath of in the SEMA category, item 3, outdoor warning siren system. This is a $5 million ask under critical. There are approximately 60 sirens that are around the city of St. Louis currently. They are beyond their useful life. Many of them do not work, are inoperable and not repairable as parts are not there for them anymore. This is the system that when a tornado comes through or severe weather comes through, if you are outside, you would hear the siren sound and it would give verbal instructions. The city currently does notifications on home phones and cell phones, but it is still very well known that a good majority of our older population does not have that technology or use it as much as the rest of us does. So there is an appetite to replace this outdoor warning system. Take a look at, the new buildings that have been built and how they affect in the downtown area, but citywide, north, central, and south, all new sirens, and we're estimating a critical cost of about $5 million for that project. And then if I would talk about one more project that two more projects, excuse me, that I would like to just cover here. So if you go to item category G, number 1, 1520 Market is what we lovingly refer to as City Hall West. It was an old federal building that the city bought to house a number of our offices as well as courts that are within that building. There are a lot of staff members as well as a lot of public that utilize that building every day of the week. There are three 600-ton chillers in that building that are well beyond their useful life. We have struggled with these. We've made parts for these because you can't buy the parts anymore. And so before we get into a situation where they all out fail, which is imminent at any day, we are asking for $2 million to replace those chillers to keep the building climate controlled. And then finally, on these critical projects that I'm highlighting, I would ask you to turn to G underneath courts, which we have 2 courts buildings. The civil courts building, which is item 3 under courts, the fire alarm, $1.9 million. Again, the same discussion as before with the Justice Center. Fire alarm systems are critical for life safety. These buildings are, populated every day by the courts folks, people on jury duty, the general public, as well as all the staff that work there. If these fire alarm systems do not operate and there are issues there, it puts people in danger. And so in order to replace that fire alarm system and match it up with a fully addressable fire alarm system to what we're currently placing in City Hall is about $1.9 million of a critical ask. And then finally, in the Carnahan's Courthouse, the same conversation, the fire alarm system again, in an old federal building that the city bought, federal courts building the city bought years ago with the original system that was placed in it. Many parts of that system do not work. It is not an addressable system. So we're asking for a $2.4 million critical ask for that fire alarm system. So I think I'm going to stop there because I think there are some questions at the bottom. Maybe we need to handle those, Paul.
Yeah, no, I was thinking that. Yeah, well, thank you, Rich. And yeah, let's go to the chats and I'll start from the top here and see what we got. All right, David, do the estimates plan for continued inflation and cost? And what streets are planned for the arterial streets budget?
Okay, so the estimates typically do not increase in cost. Typically what happens is an estimate is exactly what it says. It's an estimate of cost that we put together before we get into a project. If you will note that as I had mentioned that we're working on these projects because we had grant funding for them and we believe we had committed funding either through Board Bill 184 or through the general obligation bond issue. Those projects are currently in the hands of a consultant being designed and the right of way being acquired. So we start honing the numbers down a little bit closer to what they are from the estimate. The other thing that I will mention is that right now in the construction industry, projects are coming in somewhere between 40 to 50% over budget, simply because of the economy, the supply chain, the lack of available workforce. And so particularly projects that we see in construction now, the numbers are rising some degree. So I hope that answered your question, David. I think the other question you asked is what streets are to be paved, and I'm gonna try to find.
Yeah, I just pulled up,
Oh, there you go, you got it.
I just pulled on screen which ones they had talked about.
Great.
Both North Broadway, South Broadway, and Florissant were the big ones there.
Okay.
And are those all, the plan is to do all of those or to select from among them?
The cost is in arterial street paving for 14.9 million. And so the conversation would be is it could be, it would be nice to do all of them as a lump sum. It's possible that they could be broken down and maybe one or two would be done out of that. But I think the critical need that we're highlighting, David, is that they all need to be done.
Yeah.
And those estimates were to be all inclusive, including the ADA upgrades.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Okay, so Christie has a question, and it talks about the breakdown of funding recommendations from the committee last year, the 4 million for Compton, the over Mill Creek, the 1.8 for Lindell over Union, over Lindell Union over Forest Park, and over Metrolink was to be funded by 16.4 million capital fund surplus. What happened is they are on the list again. And so the conversation that we talked about in the very beginning was that when these bills passed the board of ENA, the mayor, the comptroller, and the president of the board of aldermen, they are then sent to the board of aldermen and committee for approval. One of the things that can happen and did happen in this case is an alderperson brings up a floor substitute or an amendment to the bill while it is being discussed before voting on it. And so what happened here is there was an amendment to the bill, and Compton over Mill Creek, Lindell Union over Forest Park, and Lindell Union over Metrolink were removed from the amendment, and the items that were added in their place were paving on Goodfellow from Delmar to Halls Ferry, traffic calming, a match to a MoDOT project from I-70 to Halls Ferry Circle, curbs, Dr. Martin Luther King to I-70, and then some medium repair projects, Kings Highway, I-70 to West Florissant, Goodfellow, Natural Bridge to I-70, and Natural Bridge Marcus to Salisbury and Parnell, as well as a sprinkler repair project, were added in lieu of the local match shares for those 3 bridges. And so it is incumbent upon us that as we have received federal grants for those projects, to reinstate the local match share in order to continue and finish the project and build the project without having to pay the federal government back for the amount that we've already spent. So it's really out of our control. It's up to the Board of Aldermen, and that is what they opted to do as an amendment on the floor.
Okay, I think Leroy had a question. I assume there are no existing structures that can be modified to serve as a PSAP.
That's a great question, and that has been asked of us on multiple occasions. And so in order to be a PSAP, there is a list of criteria that is long and rigorous. And so the list includes things like it is not in the urban core. It is structurally, well, I can actually go through some of the requirements of it. So it would have to meet the American Disabilities Act. It would have to be a hardened facility outlined in NFPA 1221 standards for installation and communication. It would have to meet the ICC 500, which is a standard for the design and construction of storm shelters. And then the building site, flood criteria, means of egress, debris hazard, occupancy and survivability, and fire safety of a major event. It needs to meet green building standards for commercial buildings, for the Environmental Protection Agency, and in particular in the city, if it's an existing building, as practicable, and if it's a new building, it needs to meet LEED Silver. It needs to meet National Electrical Fire Code, Article 708, which addresses considerations for critical operations, NFPA 110 standards for emergency and standby power systems, as well as all criteria set out for an emergency public safety answering point facility. And so what you'll find is that the standards are so detailed that to utilize an existing facility, you would be almost tearing the facility down to reconstruct it. And it's, it has to be a very open facility with not a lot of walls in the middle and open span. And so there is actually design and architectural standards that are for this. So we've looked at that. We've considered it. The conversation here and with the mayor's office is could we do something like that on a temporary basis until we built the actual PSAP? And then the conversation with that obviously is, if it would take us till the third quarter 26 to build the PSAP, we may as well just find the funding and build that and do it right. And that will be the emergency center for the city, for the next 50, 60, 70 years. And then obviously it could be built onto depending on what the population of the city does. So it's a great question. It would be almost impossible to do that. It'd be very difficult and costly.
I see Leroy had a second question. It was related to electric vehicles, but that Vanity also had a question as well related to the PSAP topic. So I was going to jump to Vanity and then get back to the electric vehicle. Vanity was one. Rich, you read off those requirements for the building. Could you? Is that something you could share with that we could send out to the committee members?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Absolutely. I will send you. We just put this together today, and I will send this to you, and you can share with everyone.
Right. Great. And we'll do that. And then additionally, Benny was asking, you mentioned earlier that response times are impaired by lack of good facilities, but is any of that due to staffing as well?
So it very well could be. I agree. I think that's a great point that yes, obviously, there needs to be more dispatchers and quite frankly, more city employees filling all the voids. And Paul, I think you could probably talk about that, better than I could, but across the board, that is a great point. Yes, lack of staffing definitely is an impairment. But now, our 911 system is well overdue, way overdue for replacement. And so, that is the idea of building the PSAP to have a, have a up-to-date quality 911 answering system for all of our first responders, for our SEMA, as well as our Citizen Service Bureau for complaints from citizens, and incorporate the EOC, Emergency Operations Center, for any disaster that may or could happen.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both too. The immediate need, obviously, with staffing is as with any other of our city services right now, a big challenge. And I think over the longer term, the new facility provides the ability for not only a better new facility, but efficiency in terms of staffing those operations, so that hopefully you can get some of that those current problems that we have resolved just by effectively they're all in one house, and so that would be a plus in the longer term. Now, going back to Leroy's second question about where the electric vehicle charging station will be located. Actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because that was one of the questions I had earlier with Rich. And I said, oh, I know who would be here to talk about it. And that would be Chris Amos. Because if you remember from last year, we had an item in Board Bill 184 for funding some of the infrastructure related to electric vehicles. And and that is also on this list as well. And I don't know, Chris, are you with us? You can hear us? Leroy's question was...
You're muted, Chris.
Are you there?
Got me now?
Great. Yeah, the question was, will you please say again where the electric vehicle charging stations will be located? And any other information pertinent, do you think that would be helpful for people to understand what you're proposing with this electric vehicle, electrical recharging infrastructure, as you mentioned?
Okay, I'd love to. The electric vehicle system is challenged particularly because of the infrastructure requirements. I mean, you can get gasoline and diesel fuel, anywhere. We get contracts at local stations, and we have our own bulk tanks for diesel and our own gasoline tanks for the police department. But when it comes to electric vehicles, they're not hybrids that run on conventional fuel and then have some electric component to them. They have to be completely charged for an onboard battery. And so we have gotten our toe wet over the last 2.5 years with electric vehicles. And we went through an entire study of the fleet with some experts from Ameren and a consultant, as well as all of our data about which vehicles would be good economically to be converted to electric first. And we identified some 240 vehicles that were part of that sweet spot where, for the price of the gasoline vehicle, plus the lifetime infrastructure broken down, on a per mile basis, that we could break even or even do a little bit better.
It's like you just froze up.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you just froze up for about 10 seconds.
Okay, so we can't use tax incentives, which the public can use and the corporations can use, but we can find vehicles now that are usable for our purposes. The Ford Transit van, full-size van, comes in a cargo variant, and the Ford pickup truck comes in a utility variant that we use a lot of. So most of those 240 vehicles are that. We've also bought some bolts. So the problem, though, infrastructure-wise, is that even with the VW grant funds we got from the state, about $300,000 worth to pay incremental costs, putting in a recharging station for 2 vehicles at a time is not very cost effective, even with the grants we've gotten from Ameren to do it, because you have to do all the wiring, change all the building electrical. And so the Facilities Management Commissioner and I have been working for some time on identifying where these vehicles are going to be and what needs to happen with them. And so the major centers where we currently park the vehicles that will be bought the next time around as electric vehicles, places like 1900 Hampton, where streets and traffic are, and the commission and the director's office, those vehicles are a high concentration of them, about 150 of them. Forest Park, where we have a high concentration of vehicles the Parks and Recreation and Forestry divisions can use. And then smaller groups around Cass Avenue for forestry and for health department to use. And so that's the majority of the 240. So our intent here is to put in the infrastructure, and instead of doing onesie twosie stations, is to put in all the wiring in the building and all the buried cables and all the data to collect the information about which vehicles are authorized to have the recharging and not, and keep track of all that. We do it all at once, but in order to do that, we need a bigger price tag than we could do just incrementally a few $1,000s at a time. And so the intent is to go ahead, this number that I'm asking for here will cover the infrastructure for those initial 240 vehicles, and it will also cover the incremental cost for the electric vehicles, so that as we put those into service and they save the money in the operating budget, we can turn that investment back around into buying additional vehicles as they become available in the types of vehicles that we need. Again, the strategy is not to go spend $600,000 on a $300,000 refuse truck because it'll never pay off. But hopefully it will come down in price at some point and we'll be able to convert the heavier vehicles as well. But for right now, it'll be 1-ton vans, 3/4-ton pickups, and mid-sized sedans is the best we could do and break even with the budget. So without throwing money away at it, we think we can make a major dent in it. But in order to do that, we have to have the investment dollars to start with and be able to put everything in an economy of scale that makes sense with the recharging infrastructure. This recharging infrastructure is going to be strictly for fleet vehicles on city fleet areas. There's a separate initiative to do recharging that's accessible to the public, like the stations that have gone in at City Hall. And those are eligible for federal funding because they're open to the public. And so the sustainability director is working on those projects, and they don't directly relate to the fleet, although of course we provide them technical assistance with the vehicle selection, the recharging equipment, if they want it. So I hope
Hey,
that
Chris, could you let everyone know what we have currently at City Hall? Because I see them there at the end, at the south end of City Hall parking lot there.
right there. Well, the total project is 12 slots, and it's going to be everything from the entrance door in the parking lot up to the handicap spot that's adjacent to the entrance to the lot used by the Board of Aldermen there. So the first phase went in already, and it went in thanks to the generosity of the electricians union donating $10,000 for the recharging equipment and using some grant funds to put that in there for the first half of it. And so as it becomes that those are being used, and those are open to anybody who visits City Hall, and there is no charging mechanism for them, so you can use it there, but it's not for somebody to park all day there. It's for people to use to park, go in and use City Hall facilities and come back out. And as soon as that picks up enough that it's being used regularly, they're going to add the other 6 spots that are right there adjacent to it. And that's the first part of that infrastructure. We also have plans for publicly available infrastructure to go into Forest Park around places like the golf course and the tennis courts and Muni Garage and things like that. And for the recreation centers north and south, where I know the sustainability director was working with the YMCA to try to do some cooperative funding for those types of things too. So the real issue is, you put the infrastructure where it's going to be used, and if it's not going to be used, then you're wasting, at least $6,000, maybe as much as $15,000 for a two-pole operation, depending on how much wiring has to be done underground. That's the most expensive part of it, is getting the power out to where the sites are that you're going to recharge the vehicles.
You mentioned there's data wires there. So if someone uses it, you are getting that information in terms of the utilization. You can.
Well, the first ones we put in are dumb ones, and so they don't have the electronics. So so technically, if you had access to the facility, which is not open to the public, you could recharge and we wouldn't know. But we've got a contract spec already written that Facilities and Equipment Services has agreed on, that if this funding comes to fruition, then everything we're going to buy from this point on, they're about $1,200 per 2-post site more if they're intelligent. But what they will do is they will allow you to say, only these vehicles can charge at these posts. So basically you have assigned spaces for the vehicles that are there. Of course, they can't be vehicles that go home. So they're just used during the day. They have to have at least a 7-hour charging window because we're using type 2 chargers, which are less expensive and less wear and tear on the vehicles. And that same technology would allow you to actually charge back for the use of the public infrastructure, but we're not talking about doing that at this point. That's just a question of where we go in the future. And so commercial entities are using that same equipment. So you can tell exactly how many minutes were used on the charger. And then you have exactly what the power cost was based on the time of day that it was. And so you know exactly what it is, which really only gives you the same data that you get now from how much gasoline or diesel you put into a vehicle. So I think it's a very important step for us to take. And mostly it's an important step because the industry is definitely headed this direction with the leadership from the federal government. And so now that the vehicles are becoming available, it's going to become more and more difficult to get things that are not electric vehicles. And so we're trying to do what's economically smart to do now and put ourselves in position so that we can expand as it becomes more financially feasible to get the bigger vehicles put into the fleet. But like operationally, there's no reason why the entire 80 vehicle refuse fleet couldn't be electrics. And we can avoid a lot of the costs and a lot of the downtime we have now from mechanical systems. The problem is that even though the trucks are there, even though they're the right type and the right operation, they're just too expensive because Mack is the only one making them, and they just started less than a year ago. And so 4 or 5 years from now, we should be able to do that. Unless we get a grant, we won't be able to put a toe in that water, though.
Yeah, I think, and you know this better than I, but I think the city has experienced that on many of its other initiatives regarding the new technology. For instance, the conversion of the LED lighting, where at first I remember when the city invested in those with the traffic lights. We first did the red and greens because the yellows weren't going to be on long enough to justify the cost. But eventually the cost comes down with improved technology. And so everything's been converted there. And then originally the street lights, that technology hadn't advanced enough to get us there to where it was the combination of enough lumens to light the street versus the cost it was to put it in, and the savings it would get from electric usage was there. But eventually that technology caught up, and now as you recall with Board Bill 184, we just allocated enough funds to finish the conversion of all the rest of the streetlights to LEDs. So yeah, hopefully as technology improves, these things become more not only sustainable for the environment, but fiscally those two mesh and they make perfect sense, and so that we can go forward and have a good plan for those. So I appreciate that, Chris, in explaining that to the committee where we are on that.
Happy to do so. If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer those as well.
So, well, that's where we are, and I'm going to share a screen again, and it's pretty much a summary of where we are with our capital needs inventories with various categories and updated numbers. And so I'd like to, again, that's on the website. I'd like to take a look at those. One of the things I always think about, and some ask, is about, okay, we presented this inventory of need. And the idea about presenting this is to give an idea all at once about what our needs are. And we know that resources are limited. So I always say this with the operating budget. Anyone can come up, and you could probably ask any director in city government to say, hey, present your need. And they would have a genuine need, and you'd want to be able to give them more money and all. But the importance is that you see it within context of all the other needs that are out there, so that the priorities can be established and you allocate resources accordingly, because you know your resources are limited. But one of the things, having presented this and being on the Citizens Advisory Committee as well, it gives you the opportunity to say, hey, look, we have some thoughts about things that you might not have considered, or we've got some projects that we either disagree with one of these projects and we'd like to say this one's more important, or we've got some project that hadn't been presented that we think might have an impact. And in past years, it might be something even small. It'd be like a park that needs more lighting that could reduce a particular crime problem you have, or something like that. So we'd like to give you that opportunity as well. So this is a rating. So what were the next steps in this is to send out a survey to all of you as members, which would both solicit your input on the capital needs inventories that have been presented. And then at the end, it's got a place for you to submit anything you think that might be of interest for the capital committee to consider as well. So that gives you the opportunity to look at that, and then we can always submit that to BPS. Hey, consider this and take a look at this and see what else might be out there, because you're another pair of eyes that are out in the neighborhoods, and so that would be a good thing to hear that if you've got some of those ideas or some alternatives for some of the things that are on the inventory that you think we should be pursuing. I remember in our discussion about the bridge demolition of the East St. Louis Bridge, and there are other options for that, and talking about that a little bit more. And so the next step for what I hope to be, first of all, are there any more questions out there that we need to address? Anyone? I didn't see anything in the chat, so I just want to make sure I do see one now. Okay. Let's see. Okay, this is a good question, and this is from Christy. What is the realistic amount that we believe will be allocated or approved? Again, last year as citizens, I went and think we had the 130 million that was originally discussed, and then when it came to the alders, they decided to remove 50 million after the recommendations had been submitted to go somewhere besides capital improvements. It's actually a very good question, Christy. I can tell you that we do have outstanding, we have a number of funds. As I mentioned, we have ARPA funds. We have we have the surplus monies from last year's operating surplus, which was just shy of $25 million. And then we have the GO bond issue that was authorized by voters this year. And that's going to be issued in tranches depending on what the property tax rate, to keep that level flat. And so my guess is that's going to be between $15 and $20 million. Now, as Rich mentioned earlier, there has been several appropriations of the ARPA monies going forward. There was one recently. I know the mayor's office initiative with the Safe Streets initiative, which was allocating additional street monies to address some of our dangerous intersections and such, and some money also for PSAP as well. So there is some overlap with those monies, but I'm thinking that even if you don't count those ARPA monies, you'd still be somewhere in the $50 million range between the surplus from last year and potentially the GO bonds. Now, with the GO, that is a little bit more restrictive in terms of use, because it has to be, the useful life is definitely the length of the bonds themselves, typically about 20 years. So we allocate things like bridges and things, longer term capital projects for that. But the other capital funds related to the surplus from the prior year are for any capital that we deem to be appropriate and as a priority. So that's sort of what we're looking at, Christy. Again, it's ultimately up to the elected officials to make those decisions, but I think that's probably where we're at. Okay, Leroy was going to send us a new inventory needs as on the 11/15. Yes, it's actually posted on the website, and if you don't have it, I could send it to you. But it is posted. If you look at where the agenda is posted, the new inventory is posted right underneath it. And as Leroy knows, he's also making the comment that the alders will always be in the wild cards, because they ultimately have the ultimate decision on some of these appropriations. So that can happen. I thank you for those. Another question? Okay. Okay, this is from Christopher Boyce. Is there any way to create a chart that breaks out capital investments that will yield matching funds? Wouldn't it be important to match? That's actually a very good point, Christopher. And on the inventory itself, let me get back there. We actually have, and this is only in and Rich, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's just streets and bridges are the only
that's
area,
correct.
where we have a potential for a match. So, and following through on your question is, you can see where the estimated total project value is of a project. So for instance, let's take this traffic management enhancement phase 5. It's got a $4 million project value, but our estimated cost of city match is only $800,000. So theoretically, if we can come up with the $800,000 match, we could leverage that to get a $4 million project done. Now, I don't know, Rich, which ones of these are actually, have these been actually applied for or would be applied for if we had the match?
They have not been applied for, but they will be if we receive the match. The only ones on here that currently have grants are the 3 bridges that were brought up before. Those have active grants in place. None of the other ones do. But you are correct that it's only in streets and bridges. It's a surface transportation improvement plan grants through East-West Gateway. And those are for streets, roadways, bridges, things of that nature. Now, I will say that we're constantly looking at these infrastructure grants that have come out from the administration. And there have been some other categories like smart categories and things like that. But those typically are not under capital needs. And most of them have not applied to us. So ours are predominantly streets and bridges.
Okay, but that is a great question because that gives you with a 20% match, you're getting a 4-to-1 on your dollar. So that's a big bang for the buck in those projects. Another. Okay, and Christy, this is one question. Last year we were given the options to suggest other projects that were not listed. There were quite a few recommendations made last year. Were they evaluated by appropriate departments? Were any added to this year as recommendations? Yeah, I'm thinking with the limitations on the funds that we had ended up last year, no, we did not. But what I would suggest is that if you put them on the survey itself, what we will do, and when this is presented to the capital committee, we'll have obviously these needs. Anything that's mentioned there, we will bring up as a potential item. I know one item that has already been we had discussed. I think it was in the buildings discussion. Someone said, "Well, what about the Board of Aldermen?" Or I think it was an AC project for the Board of Aldermen, which we discussed. And someone mentioned that. I think that one we actually had some numbers on, and I don't want to talk off the top of my head, but I know that kind of a project, BPS would then put a number on, and we'd probably discuss, say, hey, this came up in the Citizens Advisory Committee at the Capital Committee, and see is there an aptitude to accept that as a potential project, and looking at other options for funding. So yeah, I think the best way of doing that is if you put that on that, and there will be a slot for suggesting different projects. Please put those on the survey form. It'll be the last item on the survey. And when you get down there, list them out, and we'll make sure that they get vetted at some point. Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, as I mentioned, what I'd like to be able to do now is if you can take this home, digest it all. What we would be sending out is that survey, just getting your input on all of these items, plus the ability to suggest any other items for consideration. And that I hope to send that out tomorrow. So you will be looking at, good question, Vanity. Yeah, I was thinking that we'd want to get it done before the holiday. So I plan on trying to send this survey out tomorrow morning. and maybe giving you till Tuesday to come up with your recommendations. I'll probably see how that goes, but I definitely want to try to get responses in before the Thanksgiving holidays, because I want to be able to get those responses in order, get them in an order, and then we start looking towards scheduling capital committee meetings to go over some of the input that we've received from all of you guys. So that's the plan. And so what I would be doing is, again, if you got a chance, just look over all that material. In the survey, I've also found a way to link and put in some links to some of the previous presentations. I know Rich talked about the PSEP a bit, so that there you will be able to click on that question and look at that presentation itself. You can also refer to the website, which has got all of our presentations that we did this year as well as last year, and all the video recordings are also posted there for any backup material that you may need just to go over it. And again, the last question of the survey is any other projects you want for us to consider, and we'll take a look at those and try to get some information on that. So keep an eye out for your email tomorrow, and you should be hearing from us on that. Are there any other questions for tonight? Okay. Well, thank you all for your time. Again, Rich, I want to thank you. Oh, I did see one last chat. Oh, I see. Thank you. No, you're welcome, Christy. Rich, thank you for your time. Chris Amos, thank you for joining. And again, thank you all very much for your participation in this process. I think it helps a lot. And get those surveys filled out, get your input in, and that way we can convey all that information to the capital committee, and that would be a big help towards getting hopefully another bill for capital improvements passed as soon as possible. Thank you all very much. Good night.